Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The settlement sat quiet in the late afternoon. A dry wind carried dust along the main street, settling into the cracks of false front buildings. The place wasn't large. One saloon, a general store, a sheriff's office, and a few houses on the edge. Beyond them stretched miles of pale grassland. It wasn't a place where strangers were welcomed, least of all those who carried the features of the people the railroad had brought over, only to be cast aside when the work was done. Mai came walking in from the flats, her steps slow but deliberate. She was 22, though hardship had drawn fine lines on her face that made her seem older. Her tunic, once fine silk, was torn along the shoulder and hip, still carrying the dried brown of blood where a wound had half healed. Hunger had narrowed her frame, but her back stayed straight. Each step into town was weighed with risk. She knew how settlers looked at Chinese women, with suspicion, with contempt, like reminders of cheap labor that had taken men's jobs. She had avoided them for weeks, but her strength was gone. To move forward was dangerous. To turn back meant dying alone. She told herself that walking into this settlement was not surrender, but her last choice to keep living. Her heart pounded harder as she neared a small homestead on the outskirts, with a corral patched from mismatched boards. She knew this place. Years ago, before a mob burned her family's laundry in a bigger town and scattered the survivors, she had played here as a girl. She remembered a boy with kind eyes who had traded his mother's bread for the steamed buns she carried, who had sat with her by the creek without fear or scorn. The memory was a small, grounding stone she'd carried through the years. She didn't know if he would remember her, or if time and bitterness had buried those days. Still, her feet carried her to the gate. Thomas Carver was mending the corral when he saw her. He had a hammer in one hand and a sweat-stained shirt that clung to his shoulders. At 30, weathered by long seasons of drifting, Thomas had the look of a man who carried burdens he never spoke of. He had come here 2 years ago to live quieter, raising a few head of cattle and staying away from the noise of town. Keeping distance was easier than losing again. When he first noticed the figure by the gate, his body tightened. He saw the torn tunic, the way she held herself against pain, and the unmistakable features that would draw trouble in this settlement. His first thought was risk. A wounded stranger on his land meant questions, and questions meant attention he couldn't afford. For a moment, he considered turning his back, but then her face lifted, and recognition struck him like a physical blow. It was her. Mai, the girl from the laundry by the creek, the one whose quick laugh he remembered. The one he had thought about sometimes, wondering what became of her family when the anti-Chinese sentiment in the territories boiled over. She wasn't a memory anymore. She was standing here, scarred but unbroken. Mai saw the hesitation in his eyes, and a cold fear touched her stomach. If he rejected her now, there was nowhere else to go. She steadied her voice and said quietly but firmly, "Don't you recognize me, cowboy? I'm your childhood love." Thomas's jaw tightened. The words cut past years of silence. He felt a sting of guilt at how easily he could have turned away someone who once meant something to him. He wrestled with the thought of the town, of the trouble her presence would bring. Then he set his tools down and crossed to the gate. He didn't speak a welcome, didn't promise anything. Instead, he pushed the gate open, stepped aside, and gestured toward the stoop where a bucket of water stood in the shade. His voice was flat but steady. "Sit." Mai crossed into the yard, her knees threatening to buckle with relief. For the first time in weeks, fear wasn't gone, but she wasn't alone anymore. She drank from the ladle, the cool water a shock to her system. Thomas stood a few paces away, silent and watchful. He couldn't send her back out into the flats. Not when he could see the wound dark against her tunic and the raw exhaustion on her face. Inside the small house, Thomas pointed to the table, then set down a plate of cornbread and beans. He gave a short nod. "Eat." She ate in small, careful bites. While she ate, Thomas poured water into a basin and set it on the table with a clean cloth. He spoke with a measured tone, his eyes fixed on her wound. "You walked far." "From where?" She swallowed, then answered, "From the rail camp west of here." My family, our shop was burned. I kept moving east. Her voice was flat, but the words carried the truth of hunger and flight. Guilt twisted in his chest. He had heard about the riots, but had gone on with his life while hers had been torn apart. After finishing half her meal, careful not to seem greedy, Mai pulled a small pouch from her tunic. Inside was a bone needle, silk thread, and a packet of dried herbs. "I need to close the wound better," she said, her gaze steady. Without a word, he lifted the lamp and held it closer. She gritted her teeth as the needle pierced skin, her breathing sharp. She finished the job, tying the knots with care, then made a poultice from the herbs and pressed it to the wound before wrapping it with a strip of her tunic. When it was done, Elias took the other chair, sitting across from her. The truth was simple. She had survived weeks alone, but she could not last much longer without help. And he had spent too many years turning away from others. This time, he didn't want to. The next morning, the first sign of trouble came. The storekeeper's boy saw Mai sitting on the stoop and sprinted back toward the town square. Whispers turned to stares, and by noon, Sheriff Burke rode up, his horse moving slow. "Morning, Thomas," the sheriff said, his eyes resting on Mai. "Boy tells me you've got company." "That's right," Thomas replied, resting a hand on the fence. "You know how people here will take it," Burke said, his expression unreadable. "There's men in this town who lost work on the railroad. They carry a grudge. Talk brings heat." Mai listened without flinching, then spoke, her tone quiet but clear. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. I asked for food, not trouble." Thomas's jaw tightened. The thought of letting her walk back into the flats burned. He shook his head once. "You're not leaving?" The sheriff watched them both, then gave a small nod. "I'll tell folks she's under my eye. That buys time. But don't fool yourself. Eyes will stay on you." He tipped his hat and rode on. When the dust settled, Thomas looked at Mai. He knew the questions people would ask. He also knew the only answer that mattered. This time, he wouldn't look away. That night, he let her sleep on the bed while he took the chair. She stayed. He kept the door open. Whatever came from town, they would face it together. To survive in the settlement, Mai knew she had to prove her worth. The next morning, Thomas found her already awake, having swept the floor and started a pot of beans simmering on the stove, seasoned with herbs from her pouch. "Fence on the north side's loose," Thomas said, offering work, not charity. "Need a hand?" "Show me," she replied, and they worked together under the harsh sun. She was quick and learned fast, holding posts steady while he drove them in, her face tight with the strain on her ribs, but refusing to yield. Their silence wasn't empty, it was the kind that builds trust. That evening, Thomas rode into town for supplies. "Stay in the yard," he told her. People notice work more than shadows. At the store, he bought flour, salt, and a bolt of coarse cotton. The storekeeper's eyes narrowed, but Thomas met his stare. "She'll need the cloth," he said, paying in cash. It was the first time he had spoken of her as if she belonged. When he returned, he handed her the cloth. She accepted it with quiet dignity. Later, as they sat by the stove, Thomas spoke of the land. Backwaters, good soil. Could plant corn there next spring. Mai listened, then answered, "It needs a windbreak. I can show you how. We did that with brush south of the river." The moment hung between them. It wasn't a promise, but it was more than survival. For the first time, the thought of building something together edged into both their minds. Days later, a dust storm blew in, turning the sky brown and swallowing the world outside their small house. Together, they worked quickly, securing the livestock, hauling water, and stuffing rags into the cracks of the walls. The howl of the wind was a physical force, pressing in on them. They were trapped in the single room, their world shrunk to the space between four walls. They worked side by side until there was nothing left to do but wait. The storm tested them both, and neither broke. When the wind finally died at dawn, they stepped out into a world buried in grit. The damage was bad, but not ruin. They had endured it together. The storm, however, was not their greatest threat. Late one morning, two riders came down the road. They weren't drifters, they looked like men who followed trouble. They were former railroad foremen, men known for their brutal tactics and hatred for the Chinese workers they had overseen. The taller one spoke first. "We heard a Chinese girl came through these parts. Ran off from a work camp contract up north. I don't keep count of travelers," Thomas said, his rifle now resting loosely in his hands. The second rider's gaze slid past him to where I stood in the doorway. "That her," he said, a statement, not a question. "There's a reward for runaways. We'll take her and be gone." Before Thomas could answer, Sheriff Burke rode up. "You here on county business?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. "Private business," the rider sneered. "Since when does a sheriff protect a coolie?" "Since it's my job to keep the law," Burke said, his voice dropping. "Not let men snatch folks off porches. You have a warrant, you show it. If not, ride on." The taller man looked at Thomas. "You hiding her, Carver? She ain't worth the trouble." Thomas felt the weight of the moment. He could step aside, and his life could go back to quiet. But he remembered her quiet strength, the way she had stitched her own wound, the way she had stood firm in the storm. He knew his answer. "She's under my roof," Thomas said, his voice steady as iron. "That makes her my concern." The riders tensed, their hands hovering over their guns. The sheriff subtly shifted, his own revolver now visible. "You heard the man," Burke said. "You want to test that, you test me first." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. Then the lead rider cursed, jerked his reins, and turned his horse. When they were gone, the sheriff looked at Thomas. "You just made yourself part of this, Carver. You still sure?" "I'm sure," Thomas said without flinching. He turned to see Mai still in the doorway, her face calm but her eyes filled with a gratitude too strong for words. "You didn't have to," she said quietly. "Yes," Thomas answered. "I did." From that day, her presence in his house was no longer temporary. She belonged. A cry cut through the town stillness a few days later. A boy had fallen down the old well behind the church. By the time Thomas and Mai arrived, a frantic crowd had gathered, helpless. The rope they had was too short. Mai didn't hesitate. She pushed through the circle, ignoring the glares. "Bring me more rope," she commanded, her voice cutting through the panic. The men hesitated, but Thomas's hard voice spurred them to action. "Do as she says." Thomas tied the rope around Mai's waist. Her small frame was an advantage here. "I can do it," she told him, and without waiting, she slid into the darkness. Elias braced himself, his boots dug in, muscles straining as he lowered her down. She reached the terrified boy, secured him, and shouted up. The crowd surged forward to help Thomas pull. Slowly, inch by inch, Mai and the boy rose into the light. The pastor grabbed the child as the mother collapsed in relief. The crowd went silent, watching as Thomas hauled Mai the rest of the way up. She collapsed on the dirt, coughing, her hands raw. The silence broke not with whispers, but with a murmur of respect. The storekeeper's wife stepped forward and pressed a hand to Mai's shoulder. "You saved him." Their hard opinions had been dented by an undeniable act of courage. The air in the settlement changed. The sharp edge of suspicion dulled. At the store, the owner's wife quietly added a small sack of coffee to Thomas's supplies, a silent thank you. People began to see Mai not as a threat, but as the woman who had saved a child. Back at the homestead, Thomas began speaking of the future. He and Mai worked the land not just for survival, but for growth. One evening, Sheriff Burke rode out. He carried papers from the county seat. "Homestead claim," he said, handing them to Thomas. "The back quarter is still open. If you file in both your names, it gives her legal standing. Means no one can claim she has no right to be here." Thomas looked at Mai, the lantern light flickering on her face. "Saturday, we'll ride in. We'll file it together. You would put my name on your land?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It's our land," Thomas said simply. "If you choose it." On Saturday, they rode to the county seat. Thomas signed his name, and Mai carefully wrote hers beside his, the Chinese characters elegant and strong. The clerk stamped the papers. It was done. The next week, the local pastor rode out. "The sheriff told me about the deed," he said. "The law will also recognize it as a marriage claim, if you wish." Thomas looked at Mai. She met his gaze, her eyes steady. She said one word. "Yes." They stood in the yard, with the sheriff and the storekeeper's wife as witnesses. The vows were plain and short. There were no rings, no music, just a stamped record and 2 signatures that bound what was already true. As the weeks turned to summer, the land answered their work. Corn sprouted along the ridge, and the house took on the look of a place lived in by 2, not 1. One evening, as they stood by the corral, Elias said quietly, "When you came that first day, I almost didn't open the gate." Mai looked at him, her face calm. "And yet you did." He gave a short nod. "I won't close it again." She placed her hand in his, a simple act of belonging. The town never became warm, but it became fair. Their bond did not rest on grand promises, but on the simple, powerful act of staying when leaving would have been easier. What began as survival had turned into permanence. The land, once a place of silence and dust, had finally grown into their home.